crisis, and we hear all the time that the debate is over, and that the science has been settled, and so on, and that 97% of scientists agree. Okay, agree on what? Here's another poster from the Consensus Project, and here's what it says. The most comprehensive study to date has found that 97% of published papers with a position on human-caused global warming agree. Global warming is real, and we are the cause. So what exactly does this mean? The reference is to the so-called Cook study. Here again is what the President of the United States said about it in response to this study. Is this in fact what it means, that 97% of scientists agree that climate change is real, man-made, and dangerous? Well, first of all, even if that's all true, it only gets us down to halfway down the list. And if you look at the study itself, it says nothing about danger, nothing whatsoever. Secondly, it's a survey of papers, not of scientists. So that part is also wrong. It's possible for a small group of scientists to publish a whole lot of papers. It's certainly what happens in philosophy, where I wouldn't be surprised if the majority of papers are being published just by a few hundred people. So that's two major problems. Next, we have to look at the study itself to see what's actually been shown by it. It's called the Cook study because it's by a team led by the Australian environmentalist John Cook. And their paper, published last year in Environmental Research Letters, is called Quantifying the Consensus on Anthropogenic Global Warming in the Scientific Literature. Here's what it says. The team classified about 12,000 abstracts from climate journals. About a third of them either stated or implied some kind of position on global warming. Of those 4,000 or so papers, 97% of them fell into one of these three categories. They state that humans are the primary cause of recent global warming. Or they state that humans are causing some recent global warming without also saying that it's not very much. Or they implied that human activity has caused some of the recent warming, and they didn't say that it was not most of the recent warming. Then they add up these three categories, and the result is 97%. Now it seems to me that this result does not license the claim that 97% of these papers, let alone 97% of scientists, agree that we are the cause of global warming. That's just the first category at best. Note also that there's no screen for the belief that warming is going to continue or accelerate or anything like that. The other two categories don't state or imply that we are the cause of global warming, only that we are a cause of global warming, and not necessarily a significant one. I had a burrito for lunch today myself, so I've surely been adding something more than zero to the atmosphere's supply of greenhouse gas. Am I therefore the cause of global warming? To look for a consensus, then, even on the claim that we've caused most of the warming over the last century or so, we have to find the percent of papers that actually fall in category 1. Sadly, the article doesn't reveal this, and skeptical opponents had to dig through the supplementary data files to come up with the answer. Here's the breakdown of the 97% consensus reported by this study. As far as I know, this has not been challenged by the people who did the study. Out of that 97%, Category 3 accounted for 72%. Category 2 accounted for 23%. And Category 1, where the paper actually said that most of the recent global warming was caused by human activity, accounted only for 1.6% of the articles in question. In raw numbers, that's a total of 64 papers out of about 4,000 that allegedly took a position, which comes out of the original 12,000 papers examined. It seems to me that there's a big difference between 97% that gets constantly repeated and the 1.6% that actually shows up in the data if you take a look. Cook and his team make a big deal about having checked their classifications against a sample of responses from the paper's authors as a way of showing lack of bias. But that's entirely beside the main point, which is that the three categories are being conflated illegitimately. There are some other studies, by the way, that show similar numbers. I'll leave it as an exercise for people to examine these ones. This is the one that most people are talking about these days. Now, I find it really troubling that this paper got published in the first place, let alone broadcast throughout the world as if it were conclusive evidence of anything of interest, let alone it's being used as a weapon to shut people up. For what it's worth, the Journal of the American Meteorological Society is about to publish a legitimate survey of the Society's members. And it comes up with a 52% agreeing that global warming is real and being caused mostly by human beings. And this is only step 3 in the long step towards cataclysm. Although we can note that this goes all the way up to 78% for people identifying themselves specifically as climate scientists who publish mainly on this topic. It's an interesting phenomenon, I think, that the core experts among the experts have a much greater consensus, which might mean that they know more. But it can also mean that other scientists not within the group are unpersuaded by their arguments, even after 2 decades of discussion. In any case, with these numbers, it hardly seems like a settled discussion among scientists who ought to understand the issue, even if they're not writing articles about it. Finally, I want to talk about what counts as science in this whole discussion, and in particular whether this claim of a broad consensus of scientists in favor of a few preliminary facts about the climate crisis, even supposing that such a consensus exists, which it apparently does not, whether this claim of consensus ought to carry any weight at all in scientific judgments. I turn to my favorite bird ornithologist, Richard Feynman. Here's one of his famous slogans: "Science is the belief in the ignorance of experts." What does he mean by this? How can an expert be ignorant? I'll let the man explain himself how science works. This is from a famous set of lectures that he gave at Cornell 50 years ago, called the Messenger Lectures. If I can play this clip.
In general, we look for a new law by the following process. First, we guess it. Then we Then we compute the consequences of the guess to see what, if this is right, if this law that we guessed is right, we see what it would imply. And then we compare those computation results to nature, or we say compare to experiment or experience. Compare it directly with observation to see if it works. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. And that simple statement is the key to science. It doesn't make a difference how beautiful your guess is, it doesn't make a difference how smart you are who made the guess, or what his name is. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. That's all there is to it.
If you didn't get all of that, it's a rough recording. He says, in general, we look for a new law by the following process. We guess, we compute the consequences of the guess, we compare the computation results to nature. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. In that simple statement, he says, is the key to science. And that's all there is to it. There's a name for this model of science among ornithologists. It's called hypothetico-deductive falsificationism. We just have to say a little more about the kind of guesswork involved in framing a genuinely scientific hypothesis. What we do is we look for apparent patterns or regularities in nature. Then we try to imagine a natural law of some sort that matches 2 criteria. First, it has to make progress in explaining the pattern that we're trying to understand. And second, it has to fit in somehow with the background theories that we already accept. There's no sharp distinction between background theories and hypotheses. It can only be a package deal. But that's how we make the guess. And then we do exactly what Feynman says. We deduce testable consequences from the hypothesis together with the background theories, see if those predictions turn out to be true. If they do not, bye-bye hypothesis. Although we might want to replace it with something similar. If they do match, then we continue to examine the hypothesis, deducing more predictions, testing them, and so on. Eventually, typically over a very long period of time, that falsified but multiply tested hypothesis merges into the theoretical background. while we search for other patterns that might be explained by new hypotheses in an expanding package of theories. That's what's called normal science in business. Now, we need to distinguish this model of modern, fully empirical scientific method with the pre-modern methodology that passed for science prior to Galileo. And I don't mean religion exactly. It was definitely science of a sort, or natural philosophy as it was called. In the olden days, people came up with recognizably scientific hypotheses in the same essential way that we do now. They sought out patterns, they came up with hypotheses that made sense to them, that is, that fit as well as possible into their existing understanding of the world, but now also subsumed new patterns that had struck them as in need of explanation. Aristotle, for example, did tons of this kind of work, and brilliantly. Once they had an explanation that seemed to work, though, they were happy. And went on to other puzzles, except as medieval science developed in Europe, these natural phenomena, philosophers like Copernicus, say, had to submit their theories to church authorities, who were exclusively empowered to accept or reject them as consistent with or contrary to existing doctrine. Official background theories, if you like. If the new theory passed this test of authority, then it was simply accepted until it was disproven, either by surprise events in nature, or, as frequently it turned out, by Protestants, ignoring the authority of the church. This was not an especially cruel system, and by Galileo's day, the Catholic Church had actively encouraged scientific works of all sorts, provided only that the relevant committees of bishops got the final word. Is climate crisis theory modern science, or is it more like pre-modern science? Well, to the extent that it's being preserved, to the extent that it's being presented to the public as an authoritative package of supposedly settled positions that have been voted on by various committees when they have not been thoroughly tested by experience yet, or when they have failed some important partial tests, only to be patched up ad hoc after the fact. And to the extent that people who dissent from these doctrines are being denounced within and shunned by their community as the equivalent of heretics. And to the extent that mainstream scientists are relying on a priestly status as experts to protect themselves from challenges by officially unqualified outsiders. To the extent that all this stuff is going on, and it seems to me that a whole lot of it is, the science that supposedly supports the thesis that we're facing a catastrophe in climate change, and the disruptive and potentially extremely disruptive measures demanded by the movement for sustainability, is not even science in the modern sense. It's dogma. And we're expected to take it on faith from credentialed people who have nevertheless not shown themselves to be reliable. And I don't think that we ought to settle for that. I'll let my partner have the last word.
Okay, I have, can you hear me? The good fortune of having another engagement a little bit later, so I'm going to read some comments and then run. Almost run, okay. I have a few comments. As a non-expert in many of the areas covered by this talk, but as a non-expert, here's what I can throw out there. The current situation. It seems to me that the Earth's ecosystem is facing stress and possibly a crisis. And many are the indications. And a lot of you know a lot about such indications. They range from the melting of many glaciers all over the place, the acidification of oceans, and the unusual high rates of species extinctions. Again, this is based on what I read and what I hear. I'm not a scientist. The causes. A significant majority of scientists, from my understanding, researching in many areas of ecology, see our large-scale human activities in the last 200 years as a key factor in causing this stress or perhaps this crisis. It is, however, true that the 97% climate scientist approval rate that Professor Everett has discussed is not reliable. I would tend on this one. Exactly what the percentage is, I don't know. Predictions. I will say that a significant majority of scientists researching in the same ecological areas are issuing pretty dire warnings. Namely, our continued current behavior will likely cause some kind of ecological disaster or disasters. Ted calls for skepticism both regarding the extent of the crisis and regarding the extent of the human role in causing it. And I have a few comments about some of his arguments. Well, one of his arguments, which is legit, is that prominent past green, so-called green predictions have turned out to be false and damaging. That is true. But I suspect my scientist colleagues will say, we now have a lot more data and a lot better models. So the past may not, perhaps should not be taken as a predictor of the future here. Second point, we have had in the last 15 years, this is a part of the paper that maybe I might have missed in your presentation. The last 15 years, the global temperatures have in fact not continued to warm as various global warming models had predicted. And this is true. But a warming trend need not be sort of straight line. It could zigzag up, and there could be pauses, and this could be one of it. And some scientists are saying that a possible or the possible reason for this current cooling pause is the amount of heat that oceans are absorbing. Third point, Ted makes the point that scientific hypotheses, genuine scientific hypotheses, will always be open to disconfirmations, and there is no disagreement there. Fourth point, the social equity and fairness part of the sustainability statement or statements are, that says, political and out of place. And my comment is that political, maybe, out of place, probably not. Why? Well, because a society with many in very desperate need probably will yield a lot of desperate and short-sighted actions that are indifferent to the ecological, long-term costs for the planet. Also, societies with large and increasing wealth gaps, wealth and power disparities, are probably not sustainable. Violent turmoil at some point would not be surprising. Example, the Roman Empire, my own fellow past people, after 400 years of republicanism, 400 years, the Roman Empire took a violent turn towards civil war and monarchy, or otherwise known as emperors. And this was partly because of the huge wealth and power disparities in the newly enriched Roman society of the 1st century BC, give or take, where, incidentally, the Senate at that time, we still have a Senate, that largely served the interests of the obscenely rich classes of Rome. Fifth point, our measures for dealing with human-caused crises, ecological crises, likely to be ineffective and even harmful? Well, sure, as in all complex problems, Some measures will be better than others. And so we have to be careful as to which ones we adopt. Fuel made out of corn to use as gasoline and so forth probably is not a good idea. And there are lots of others. But we could have a green, healthy economy. And in fact, Japan, as an example, apparently has taken significant steps in that direction. For example, Japan, apparently, going to by statistics that we read, apparently recycles and reuses 98% of the metals it uses for its various productions. That's very high. Point number 6. Ted points out that the US public is not too concerned about the big alleged global ecological crisis. And that is true. But very little follows from this. After all, only 31% of the public is very confident about evolution or natural selection. That's 31%, with 42% not confident, and a bunch of people in the middle. Recall also that public doubt can be manufactured. If you throw enough money out there. For decades, tobacco companies were able to recruit some scientists who were skeptical of tobacco being harmful. That helped to create public doubt. In the last 15 years, one company alone, according to my resources, ExxonMobil, has spent at least $8 million to fund climate skeptics. One well-known skeptic, a Harvard astrophysicist by the name of Willie Soon, has admitted receiving $1 million from oil companies. Well, when billions, if not trillions of dollars of profit are at stake, we need to have some doubts about at least many of the dollars, excluding my colleague Ted, who, as far as I know, has not received one penny from the
Still way out.
That's it for me, thank you.
We will take, obviously, questions and comments from any of you.
Hi, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. Are you picking me?
Yeah. Yeah, other than just socializing.
My friend Ted, Ted is a friend of mine. He's somebody that I like and admire a lot. I certainly admire his intellect. But one thing that you see about Ted is that he's very funny, and he's charming, and he's witty. He's a great guy to have here. He really is. He's very, very funny. And where I'm going with this is I'm a social psychologist, and one of the things I study and one of the things I teach is the science of persuasion. What persuades people? How do people have attitudes change? And one of the things that's really powerful in persuasion is humor. And when people hear jokes, when they hear something witty, when they hear something funny, they don't think critically about the data or the logic or the facts behind an argument. So for instance, Ted made an argument, or made a joke about the polar bear on ice floe. And he said that the polar bear could swim somewhere, could swim up to 800 miles and so forth. And that may have short-circuited the thinking process among many people in the audience and made it harder to think critically about where's the polar bear going to go if there isn't any ice in the Arctic anymore for 900 miles. You know, what that may have done is made it hard for people to think about the data. Now, I'm not saying that Ted is dishonest, and I'm not saying that Ted is willfully trying to delude people. This seems to be the style of argument that humanities people engage in. But it's important to know that when somebody tells a talk full of humor like this, it's hard to think critically about the argument. You may have also missed that Ted acknowledged that he's not a climate change scientist. And he didn't question any of the technical data at all in climate change. He never attempted to question any of that data at all. And that's something that I think is really important that when you go out of here, you remember. Remember some of the jokes. I'm going to remember some of them, and I'm going to use them in my class on Tuesday. And now I'm doing the same thing I'm accusing Ted of, so I guess I should slide my hand. Remember the jokes, keep them in mind, but remember that he hasn't challenged any of the technical data. Again, I'm a psychologist, I'm a social psychologist, and we study, one of the things that I in particular study is persuasion and thought and so forth. And we know in psychology that people have bounded rationality. People have a limited ability to think rationally. They particularly have a limited ability to think rationally about events that are going to happen way in the future. So it's not surprising that many of the public aren't concerned about global warming that's going to happen in 2050. Our brains evolved in a very, very different environment than the kind that face us now with the problems of global warming. So, you know, this issue about Ted saying that the public is not on board and so forth, in addition to the, I would say, propaganda that Carlo talked about, there's a limit for people's ability to think ahead like that. Ted also made several comments about psychiatry. He made a joke, in fact, that he's on his medicine and so forth. You don't have to be crazy. You don't have to be a psychiatric patient to not understand basic problems like this. Look at the obesity epidemic. Would anybody argue that everybody who's obese is a psychiatric patient? No. There are psychological limitations in people's ability to think rationally, and sometimes that contributes to obesity. You don't have to argue that the public is either not concerned about global warming because they're psychiatric patients or this is not an issue. You don't have to argue that. A couple more points, and I'll give up the floor. Ted talked about the track record a lot. He made a lot of points about the track record. Most of the people that were making those kinds of predictions weren't natural scientists. And if you bring up track record, it's also important to remember that at one time they said that we never ever fish all the cod out of the North Atlantic. There was too many of them. There's just no way we would ever get all the cod out of the North Atlantic. Look what happened. You can't fish for cod anymore. They said that we'd never kill all the buffalo. They said we'd never kill all the passenger pigeons. They said we'd never cut down the forest in the United States. And we came really, really close to doing that. So track record is important. You sure need to think about that. But there's been just as many mistakes, if not more, on the other side that are really, really damaging, really, really incriminating. And this business about consensus, I did a quick Google search while Ted was talking, and there are literally dozens upon dozens of scientific societies, the American Chemical Society, for instance, that have agreed that global warming is dangerous and that humans are contributing to this. Right now, you can argue that perhaps the leaders of these societies have co-opted leadership and so forth, but that sure sounds like a consensus of scientists to me, a large consensus. These aren't just individuals who are saying this, these are whole professional organizations of natural scientists. Now, Ted mentions the American Meteorology Society. I don't know about that organization or not, but I wonder how many people in that are the local TV weather person on Fox News. I wonder when people are defining consensus, how many really practicing natural scientists go into those figures that seem to suggest that lots of scientists disagree with global warming. And I wonder, again, how many of those people are on the pay of Exxon, wrong conversation. And I think that's a valid kind of concern to make. Also, Ted's a friend of mine, and I admire him, I like him a lot, but I have to question his use of language. He said things like, shut people up, and that's a quote. There's no evidence that people are being shut up. You get on the internet, and there are all kinds of people denying the scientific facts behind global warming. that kind of language, I think, is not fair.
Thanks for your question. I like you too.
Stop making us laugh.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. I'm so charming. Yeah, I don't know if you mentioned how good looking I am as well. That's an important feature, I think, of my abilities as a philosopher. That's why I always send a little picture of myself and a tape recording of some of my jokes when I send articles in for publication at professional journals. There's so much there. Jim, if I can maybe just stress this point, right? And maybe this is a difference between social psychologists and philosophers. I give my audience the benefit of the doubt. I give people the benefit of the doubt. For me, as for Descartes, most human beings are adequately rational to understand reasonable arguments, right? If you start, and I know that there's evidence for the kind of thing that you talk about, but I would be very, very wary of carving off large parts of the population as incapable of participating in this discussion, and presupposing that there's a greater ability, some overall cognitive ability to handle the truth, as it were, among people with PhDs. It's not my experience, but that's anecdotal. Yeah, in the back.
I came in a little late, unfortunately, but I heard you mention the American Meteorological Society.
Uh-huh.
You say that they did not support climate change. Believe that climate change.
They had a big survey, and the result was that of all their members, 52% agree that human beings are causing most global warming. But that if you look at the people who, it sort of goes up in scale, if you look at the people who identify themselves as climate scientists particularly, and who say that they publish their stuff primarily in climate journals, right? Those people believe 78% agree that global warming is mostly caused by people. I think that's an interesting number. Certainly not 97%.
I just found on their Wikipedia page they have an official position on that, and they do agree with us. They do agree with the general consensus that it is humans causing it.
Well, we started this talk, or I guess I did, with reading the Geneseo official statement about sustainability. That wasn't put to a vote, right? That was constructed by the Sustainability Commission. I know some people on the commission, right? And some of them are extremely good people, but they're not a random sampling of faculty here. Yeah, no, go ahead.
I mean, I'm not sure if a random sampling would be really the most effective gauge, because certain people, climate scientists, know more about this issue.
Well, okay, but